In the middle of an opulent wedding ceremony, the unexpected happened. The grand double doors at the end of the hall burst open with a force that silenced a room. The sound echoed like a gunshot, and all eyes turned, wide with disbelief, to see a man standing at the entrance. The warm, golden glow of chandeliers barely reached him as the bright daylight behind cast him in stark silhouette. He wore a suit that had clearly seen better days, its fabric wrinkled and weathered, and his hair, tousled and wild, looked out of place amidst the polished elegance of the hall. But his eyes blazed with desperation and an unyielding resolve. "This wedding cannot continue," he declared, his voice cutting through the stunned silence with the force of an undeniable truth. "Elena cannot marry him, because she promised to marry me." A collective gasp rippled through the room, filling the space with a wave of whispers and shocked murmurs. Heads turned, craning to get a better look at the audacious stranger. Some clutched their pearls, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was as though the room had collectively forgotten to breathe. The bride, Elena, stood frozen at the altar, her fingers clenched so tightly around her bouquet that her knuckles turned white. Underneath her delicate veil, her face was as pale as the lace that covered it, and her eyes, wide with shock, were locked on the man at the door. Beside her, Charles the groom, a man known for his composure and unrelenting ambition, stood rigid. The practiced smile that had graced his face moments before vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. The whispers of the guests seemed to grow louder, and the tension in the room became suffocating. The priest, who moments ago had been prepared to unite the couple in holy matrimony, now looked between them, unsure whether to step back or attempt to calm the situation. Elena's mind was a whirl of memories and emotions, each one crashing into the next with the force of a tidal wave. It was him, Lucas, the man she had once loved so deeply, whose laughter still echoed in the hidden corners of her mind, whose promises had been carved into her heart. He was the man she had believed dead, lost to the sea on that fateful day when his boat capsized in the storm. She had mourned him, buried him in the silent corners of her memory, and rebuilt herself piece by painful piece. But now, here he stood, flesh and bone, eyes locked on hers as if no time had passed at all. Charles's voice sliced through the air, low and sharp. "Who do you think you are, interrupting a sacred ceremony like this?" His eyes, once an icy blue, now darkened with barely restrained fury. He took a step forward, his broad shoulders blocking Elena from Lucas's view, as if by sheer force he could push the past back into obscurity. Lucas didn't move, didn't even blink. The hall seemed to shrink around them, each second stretching into eternity. "I'm someone who deserves answers, Charles. And so does Elena." His gaze shifted to her, softening as he said her name, and for a moment, the raw emotion in his eyes made her forget where she was. It made her forget the hundreds of eyes watching, judging, waiting for her next move. "I came back for you, Elena, and I won't leave until you know the truth." Gasps rippled through the crowd, growing louder as the tension crackled like a live wire. Charles's expression shifted, and for a moment, something feral glinted in his eyes. His jaw clenched, and the muscles in his face twitched. "You're mistaken if you think this changes anything. Elena, this man is a ghost, a remnant of your past. We've built a future, a life. Are you going to throw it all away for someone who couldn't even be there when you needed him?" The accusation stung, and Elena felt the weight of every word like a blow. The life she had tried to piece together with Charles flashed before her eyes. The engagements at glittering events, the promises of stability and power, a safe future carved out of compromise and resignation. But standing before her was Lucas, who had once promised her a life not of riches or prestige, but of freedom, laughter, and love. She took a breath that felt as if it scraped against her lungs, trying to steady the tremor in her voice. "Lucas, how?" The question escaped her lips, barely more than a whisper, but in the silence of the hall, it carried to every ear. Lucas's eyes softened, a brief glimmer of relief breaking through his hardened expression. "I survived, Elena. The storm took me, but it didn't keep me. I fought, found my way back, but when I did, I heard you were gone, promised to someone else." His voice cracked on the last word, and a murmur of sympathy flitted through the crowd, breaking the tension for just a moment. Charles's composure snapped. His voice rose, sharp and authoritative. "Elena, don't let this man's empty words sway you. He's nothing but a disruption." He glanced over his shoulder at the guests, eyes narrowing. "You all see this for what it is, a desperate attempt to cling to what he's already lost." But Lucas stepped forward, defiance in every line of his body. "You're wrong, Charles. I'm not here to take back what's lost. I'm here because Elena deserves to know the truth. Because there are things you did, things you hoped would never come to light." The whispers surged, louder this time, and the guests leaned forward, captivated by the drama unfolding before them. Elena's father, who had been silent through the entire ordeal, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the men now fighting for his daughter's attention and allegiance. Elena's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She felt trapped between the ghosts of her past and the shadow of her future. Lucas's eyes were earnest, pleading for her to see him, to remember. And Charles's eyes, now so dark and stormy, promised consequences if she wavered. She took a step back, the bouquet trembling in her hands. The room held its breath, suspended in the space between a choice and its fallout. She looked at Lucas, the man who had been her everything, and then at Charles, who had built a future around control and power. As the first tear slid down her cheek, Elena knew that whatever came next, her world would never be the same again. The tension in the grand hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. The ornate decorations, once symbols of celebration, now stood as silent witnesses to a drama unfolding that no guest would soon forget. The whispers among the attendees had subsided, replaced by an almost oppressive silence as everyone strained to catch every word. Elena, still trembling from the shock of Lucas's arrival, felt as if the ground beneath her feet had turned to quicksand. Lucas took another step into the hall, each stride purposeful, eyes never leaving Elena. His gaze held a mix of urgency and pain, emotions that seemed to reach out and hold her in place. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Charles stepped forward, his expression carved from stone. The groom's voice was low, cold, and laced with warning. "You've made your point. Now leave before you make an even bigger fool of yourself." Lucas met Charles's stare without flinching. "I'm not going anywhere, none till she knows the truth," he said, his voice resonating through the hall like a bell tolling the end of an era. The guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes wide as they exchanged anxious glances. No one dared to move. Even the priest stood rooted to the spot, unsure of how to proceed. Elena's hands felt numb around the bouquet, petals trembling with each shaky breath she took. Her eyes darted between Lucas and Charles, two men who represented such starkly different paths in her life. Finally, she found her voice, though it wavered with the weight of everything unsaid. "Lucas, what truth? What is this about?" Lucas's expression softened, and the hardness in his eyes gave way to something deeper, more vulnerable. "It's about what happened the day I disappeared, Elena. It's about why I couldn't come back to you, and why you were led to believe I was gone forever." The murmurs in the crowd rose again, a wave of speculation and disbelief. Charles's posture stiffened, and a flicker of something, was it fear, crossed his face before he masked it with an air of indignation. "This is absurd. Whatever story you've concocted to disrupt our wedding ends here. But Lucas wasn't deterred. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he prepared to share what had haunted him for years. "I didn't just get caught in a storm and disappear," he began, his voice carrying the weight of suppressed agony. "That storm was no accident. I was targeted, misled by false coordinates that took me into dangerous waters. And when I was stranded, fighting to survive on an isolated island, I learned something that changed everything." A collective gasp swept through the hall. Elena's eyes widened, the blood draining from her face. "Targeted? By who?" she whispered, though the question carried across the room. Lucas's gaze turned to Charles, and the silence that followed was deafening. Charles's expression darkened, the mask of calm slipping just enough to reveal the storm brewing beneath. "You're accusing me?" He laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Do you hear this, everyone? This man has returned with wild accusations, desperate for attention." But Lucas took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "Desperate, yes. Desperate to tell the truth. I have proof, Elena," he said, turning to her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "A letter written by someone who worked for him, someone who couldn't live with the guilt of what they'd done." Elena's vision swam as she tried to process the onslaught of revelations. The room felt suddenly smaller, closing in on her as she struggled to comprehend what Lucas was saying. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might break free from her chest. "Charles, is this true?" Her voice cracked, barely holding back the tremble that threatened to break her composure. The murmurs in the crowd turned into a low hum, a growing wave of shock and speculation. Charles's jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle ticked beneath the skin. "You cannot seriously be entertaining this nonsense, Elena," he said, his tone growing harsher. "This man is deranged, spinning lies to tear us apart." Lucas's hand moved into the pocket of his worn suit, pulling out a small, creased piece of paper. "Read it," he said, his voice breaking through the noise like a blade. He extended the letter to Elena, but before she could move, Charles reached out to snatch it from his hand. Lucas was quicker, pulling back just in time. "Not this time, Charles." The tension between the two men was palpable, their glares locked in a battle of wills. Charles's polished exterior was beginning to fracture, and Elena saw for the first time the cracks in the man she thought she knew. The guests, now on the edge of their seats, could feel the shift in power, the unraveling of truths that had long been buried. Elena took a step forward, holding her breath as she reached for the letter in Lucas's hand. The hall seemed to hold its breath with her, the silence punctuated only by the rustle of her dress as she moved. With trembling fingers, she took the paper and unfolded it, her eyes scanning the shaky handwriting that would either confirm or shatter the reality she'd clung to. The words on the page blurred for a moment, her mind unable to accept what she read. Betrayal, conspiracy. The sinking feeling in her stomach turned into a cold dread. She looked up at Charles, whose eyes had narrowed, his mask of charm gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Elena," Charles began, his tone taking on a dangerous edge. "Think carefully about what you're reading. Think about who stands beside you, who has built this life with you." Her voice trembled, but it was resolute. "I am thinking, Charles. For the first time, I am seeing what's been hidden in plain sight." She turned to Lucas, tears brimming in her eyes. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" Lucas's eyes softened, regret etched across his features. "I tried, Elena, but by the time I returned, I learned that you were engaged to Charles. And I knew that revealing the truth then would only bring more chaos into your life. But today, I couldn't let you walk into this without knowing." Charles took a step closer, eyes narrowing into slits. "And now what, Lucas? You've disrupted a wedding, aired out your wild accusations. What do you hope to gain?" Lucas's eyes hardened, resolve flooding back into his voice. I'm not here to gain anything. I'm here to set things right. The room was a battlefield, emotions running high, truths exposed under the harsh light of reality. And in that moment, Elena knew that whatever path she chose next, nothing would ever be the same. The silence that followed Lucas's revelation felt like it could stretch for eternity. Every eye in the grand hall was wide with shock, glued to the scene unfolding before them. The crystal chandeliers overhead, which once sparkled as beacons of celebration, now seemed to cast shadows, illuminating the deep cracks forming in the facade of the wedding that was meant to be flawless. Elena stood in the center of this storm, the letter in her hand trembling, as if the words scrawled on it were a live wire sparking with the power to change everything. Her father, seated in the front row with a face marked by years of wisdom and worry, leaned forward, his expression shifting from joy to confusion. He could barely grasp what he was witnessing. Lucas, the man believed lost, had returned from the grave, not with tender words or soft reunion, but with accusations that threatened to unravel every strand of Elena's carefully reconstructed life. And then there was Charles, who stood close by, eyes narrowed, fists at his sides, struggling to maintain the poise that had always been his shield. The collective breath of the room hung in the air, waiting for anyone, to make sense of what was happening. Lucas's voice, though cracked with the strain of years spent holding back the truth, was steady. "I survived, Elena," he said again, his gaze never leaving her, even as the tension in the room prickled his skin. "But that storm was no accident. It was planned. I was sent out with false coordinates, deliberately led into dangerous waters." Gasps rippled through the room, shock blooming like wildfire as guests turned to each other, murmuring in disbelief. The air buzzed with the sound of dresses rustling and chairs creaking as people shifted, leaning forward to catch every word. The murmurs grew louder, a tide of disbelief crashing against the walls of the grand hall. Elena's father rose from his seat, his aged face drawn tight with worry. "Elena, what is he talking about?" His voice was hoarse, a blend of concern and disbelief. The crowd fell silent at his words, the weight of paternal concern slicing through the chaos like a knife. Elena's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She looked at the letter in her hand, its edges crumpling under the pressure of her grip. The ink seemed to blur as her mind raced. She felt torn between the past she had buried and the present that was crumbling before her. With trembling hands, she met Lucas's eyes, searching for confirmation that this was more than a nightmare she might wake from. Charles's voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the whispers. "You have no proof," he spat, his mask slipping to reveal the shadow of a man who would not go down without a fight. His polished facade cracked as he looked at Lucas, his jaw clenched, eyes glinting with suppressed fury. "Elena, are you really going to entertain the ravings of a man who disappeared without a trace? He abandoned you." Lucas's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I didn't abandon her," he said, his voice hardening as he looked at Charles with the kind of gaze that could strip away pretense. "I was taken from her, and you made sure she would never know the truth." The room held its collective breath, the tension so thick that it seemed to wrap around everyone present, pulling them into the center of this storm. Elena's mind spun as the puzzle pieces began to align, memories resurfacing with painful clarity. The hurried engagements, the strange evasions, the moments when Charles's charm felt practiced rather than genuine. Why now? Elena's voice, though quiet, silenced the room once more. She looked at Lucas, tears pooling in her eyes. "Why didn't you come back sooner? Why did you let me believe you were gone for so long?" Lucas's face softened, the anger in his expression giving way to raw, unfiltered pain. "I tried, Elena. By the time I returned, it was too late. You were engaged to Charles, and I thought," his voice caught in his throat, and he paused to steady himself. "I thought telling you then would only cause you more pain. But today, watching you about to marry the man who did this, it was too much." Charles's facade crumbled further, his polished demeanor slipping away to reveal the tightly coiled tension beneath. He took a step forward, his voice dropping into a growl. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I saved her from grief, from the despair you left her in. And now you come here to ruin everything for some misguided notion of redemption." Lucas didn't back down. "The only one who ruined things, Charles, is you. You orchestrated everything, thinking no one would ever find out." The guests exchanged frantic looks, a low hum of disbelief rippling across the room once more. Elena's father stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out, but stopping just short. "Elena, you have to decide what this means. No one can make this choice for you." The words struck her heart like a hammer. She turned to Charles, searching his face for any sign of the man she thought she knew. What she saw was the cold, unfeeling mask of someone who believed he had already won. Then she looked at Lucas, eyes filled with the kind of pain that only comes from losing everything and daring to fight for it once more. Tears finally spilled over, tracing paths down her cheeks. She spoke, not to the men standing before her, but to herself, as if confirming a truth she had long avoided. A life built on lies will never be whole. The tension in the room snapped as the truth of her words echoed. Charles's eyes narrowed to slits, his fists tightening as he took one last desperate step toward her. The hall, once a sanctuary of joy, now thrummed with a tension so thick that it seemed to pull the air from the room. The guests, many of whom had been friends of the family for years, were paralyzed, caught in the crossfire of a battle they could never have predicted. The heavy scent of roses and lilies that once symbolized love now felt cloying, pressing against Elena's senses as she stood at the center of it all. Her pulse roared in her ears, and the letter in her hand, with its damning words, weighed as heavily as a stone. Charles's eyes were locked onto her, a storm swirling within them. His control, so carefully cultivated over the years, was splintering. "You're making a mistake, Elena," he said, his voice pitched low but vibrating with a warning. It was a tone she had never heard from him before, one that sent a shiver down her spine. Elena's hand trembled as she lowered the letter, meeting his gaze without flinching for the first time. "The mistake, Charles was trusting you," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. The crowd held its collective breath, eyes shifting nervously between the two of them. The tension was so sharp, it felt like even the chandeliers above might shatter under its weight. Lucas, who had been standing a few steps back, moved to her side, his presence a silent testament to everything that had been lost and found again. He didn't touch her. There was no need. The understanding that passed between them was enough. His eyes stayed trained on Charles, ready for any sign of retaliation. A flicker of desperation crossed Charles's face before he smoothed it away. His mask of confidence cracked, revealing the raw anger that boiled just beneath the surface. "So, this is how it is." His voice was louder now, echoing through the hall. "You throw away everything we've built for a man who waltzes back in with stories and accusations." Murmurs rippled through the guests, and a few exchanged worried glances. Elena's father, who had been watching with a face carved from stone, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing on Charles. "You speak of what you've built, but at what cost?" His voice, though steady, carried the weight of disappointment and betrayal. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. Charles's eyes darted from Elena to Lucas, and then to the crowd, calculating his dwindling options. The control he so desperately clung to was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. The rage that flickered in his gaze turned darker, more dangerous. He took a step closer to Elena, lowering his voice so only she and Lucas could hear. "You have no idea what you're doing, Elena. This isn't just about us. If you walk away now, you'll regret it." Elena's jaw tightened, tears glistening in her eyes, but refusing to fall. "I'd rather face the unknown with honesty than stay trapped in a life built on lies," she replied, each word a nail in the coffin of their shared past. Lucas's expression softened for a moment, pride and empathy mingling in his eyes. But before the weight of the moment could settle, Charles's patience snapped. His composure shattered, and the veneer of civility peeled away to reveal the true man beneath, the one who had orchestrated betrayals and built his success on manipulation. "Enough of this." Charles's voice cracked like a whip, drawing gasps from the crowd. He turned to the guests, arms outstretched in a dramatic display. "You've all known me as a man of stature, a builder of fortunes, a savior of families. And now, you'll let this charade define me? You'll let whispers and a letter tear down what I've created?" The room shifted, some guests visibly uncomfortable, others murmuring in quiet support. But the momentum was no longer on his side. The air was thick with disbelief and shifting loyalties. Elena felt the finality of the moment settle over her, and with it, a sense of peace she hadn't expected. "Charles," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "this ends now." For a moment, he stood frozen, staring at her as if he could will her to change her mind. But the realization settled in his eyes. She was gone, not physically, but in every other way that mattered. The defiance in his expression melted into resignation, and he took a step back, eyes cold and distant. Lucas moved closer, his presence a beacon of stability amidst the chaos. The silence in the room was so complete that when Charles finally spoke, it sounded like the echo of a defeated man. "You'll regret this, Elena," he whispered, the words barely audible, but carrying a weight that would stay with her. Without another word, Charles turned on his heel and walked down the aisle, each step ringing like a death knell. The grand doors closed behind him with a resounding thud that sealed his departure, and the end of everything he had once controlled. The guests stirred, some with tears in their eyes, others still in shock. Elena's father stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening with pride. Lucas, now standing beside her, reached for her hand, and this time, she let him take it. The warmth of his touch anchored her, reminding her that in the ruins of what was, there was a chance to rebuild. The priest, who had stood silent throughout the ordeal, cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the crowd. "There are moments when truth, no matter how painful, paves the way for a new beginning," he said, a slight smile touching his lips as he looked at Elena and Lucas. Elena squeezed Lucas's hand, a tear finally slipping down her cheek. "It's not going to be easy," she whispered, voice trembling with both fear and hope. Lucas met her gaze, a soft smile breaking through the tension. "No, it won't, but it will be real, and that's enough." And as the guests began to applaud softly, an unexpected, tentative sound in a hall that had seen so much, Elena felt the weight lift from her chest. This was not the day she had expected, but was the beginning of a story that was finally truly hers. The applause that had started as a hesitant ripple gained momentum, swelling to fill the grand hall with a warmth that dispelled the lingering shadows of deceit. Elena stood in the center of it all, a storm of emotions swirling within her, relief, grief, and a newfound strength. The letter that had once felt like a heavy burden now sat crumpled in her hand, no longer an anchor, but a testament to the truth that had set her free. Lucas's hand remained firmly in hers, grounding her amidst the chaos. His eyes, filled with quiet admiration and a touch of sadness, met hers. They exchanged no words, but in that moment, an understanding passed between them that needed no explanation. Their journey, once fractured by the cruel hands of fate, had found its way back to this crossroads. Elena's father stepped forward, his presence reassuring. Lines of concern that had furrowed his brow softened, and a small, proud smile tugged at his lips. He placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "Elena," he said, his voice strong but thick with emotion, "you've shown more courage today than I could have ever imagined. No matter what happens next, know that you have my unwavering support." Tears pricked at Elena's eyes again, but this time they were not born of sorrow. She nodded, covering his hand with hers. "Thank you, Father. That means everything." The priest cleared his throat, stepping forward from his post at the altar. His eyes, which had been solemn throughout the turmoil, now held a glimmer of hope. "We gather here for many reasons, most often for union and celebration. But today, we've witnessed something even more profound, the reclaiming of truth and the resilience of the human spirit. Elena, Lucas, would you like to say anything before we close this chapter and let you take your next steps?" Elena glanced at Lucas, the weight of the moment pressing down on her, yet lifting her up all at once. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she turned to the gathered guests, who were now watching with expressions ranging from awe to quiet contemplation. "Today was not what any of us expected," she began, her voice carrying across the room with surprising strength. "But it has revealed what is most important. Not power, not image, but truth and love. For too long, I lived under the shadow of half-truths, believing that strength meant silence. But I was wrong." A murmur of agreement swept through the hall, and Elena felt emboldened. She squeezed Lucas's hand, and he nodded, a soft smile breaking through the pain etched on his face. "From this day forward," she continued, her gaze moving from the guests to Lucas and then to her father, "I choose to build a life that's rooted in honesty, no matter how difficult. And I hope that today serves as a reminder to each of you to value what truly matters." The hall fell silent once more, but this time it was a silence filled with reverence, the kind that follows a hard-earned revelation. Lucas stepped forward, his voice deep and steady. "Elena's right. Today isn't just the end of one story, it's the beginning of another. One where past wrongs are righted, and where hope has a chance to thrive." Applause broke out again, this time louder, more confident, as if the collective weight of witnessing the painful truths had given way to a new, shared hope. The guests stood, some dabbing at their eyes, others exchanging nods and smiles of approval. Amidst the noise, Elena caught sight of a familiar figure standing at the back of the hall, a woman in a simple dress, eyes wide with pride and tears glistening in the corners. It was an old friend, someone who had known Lucas and Elena when they were just children with dreams too big for their small town. The sight of her brought a rush of memories that filled Elena's chest with warmth. She realized that this moment was not just about loss or betrayal. It was about rediscovery and moving forward. The doors of the hall, which had closed with the resounding exit of Charles, now stood open, letting in the soft light of the afternoon sun. It was as if the world beyond was beckoning, ready for them to step into the next chapter. Elena turned to Lucas, her heart steady for the first time in what felt like years. "Shall we?" she whispered, her voice laced with both determination and the tentative joy of starting anew. Lucas smiled, a full, genuine smile that reached his eyes and softened the lines of worry that had etched themselves there. "Yes," he said, his voice equally tender. "Let's go." And as they walked hand in hand down the aisle, through the crowd of well-wishers and into the light that spilled from the open doors, they knew that what lay ahead would not be easy. But it would be theirs, and that was enough. As Elena and Lucas stepped into the soft, golden light of a late afternoon, the world outside the hall seemed to welcome them with open arms. The whispers of the guests faded behind them, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. The air was fresh, carrying with it a hint of jasmine from the nearby garden that surrounded the venue. It was stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere they had just escaped. Elena paused at the top of the marble steps, her hand still in Lucas's, the warmth of his touch grounding her amidst the chaos of emotions swirling within. She turned to face him, eyes searching his face as if to reassure herself that he was really there. Every line, every scar and shadow on his features told the story of resilience and loss, yet also of hope and love. "Lucas," she began, her voice soft and almost hesitant. The weight of everything unsaid, all the years they had lost, hung between them. "I need to know everything. Not just about today, but about what happened after you left, after the storm." Lucas's eyes met hers, their blue depths reflecting a mixture of relief and sadness. He took a deep breath, the kind that seemed to reach into the corners of his being, and nodded. "You deserve to know, Elena. And I promise, I won't leave anything out." They found a secluded bench at the edge of the garden, partially hidden by towering hedges and fragrant flowers. The noise from inside the hall was now just a dull hum, a reminder of the world they had left behind. Lucas sat beside Elena, his gaze fixed on the horizon for a moment before he began to speak, each word laced with the pain of memories resurfacing. "It was supposed to be a routine trip," he said, his voice steady but tinged with the rawness of recollection. The weather report had said clear skies, perfect for sailing. But something fell off even before we set out. I remember checking the map twice, even 3 times, because the coordinates didn't sit right with me. But I thought it was just nerves. He paused, eyes narrowing slightly as he sifted through the tangled web of memories. Looking back, it's clear now that those coordinates were deliberate, meant to lead me straight into the storm. Elena's heart clenched, each beat a reminder of the helplessness she had felt when news of Lucas's disappearance had reached her. But why, Lucas? Why would someone do that? Lucas's expression darkened, and he turned to face her fully. Power, control. Charles wanted all. I had heard whispers about him back then, dealings and connections that went beyond what most people saw. But I never imagined he'd go so far as to remove someone who was in his way. The storm hit harder than I could have prepared for. The boat capsized, and I was thrown into the sea. I fought to stay afloat, clinging to debris until the darkness pulled me under. Elena reached for his hand, squeezing it as if to anchor him in the present, away from the haunting past. He looked down at their joined hands, a small smile flickering on his lips before fading. "I washed ashore on a remote island," he continued. "For weeks, there was nothing but the sea and sky, no sign of rescue or civilization. I survived on rainwater and what little food I could find. Time became a blur, and all I could think about was getting back to you, making sure you were safe. But by the time I was finally found and brought back to the mainland, months had passed. I returned to find that you were engaged to Charles, and he was already building a narrative that painted him as your savior." Elena's breath hitched, the weight of realization pressing down on her. "He told me you were gone, that there was no hope of finding you." Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over as the betrayal she had tried to bury resurfaced with new, brutal clarity. "I grieved for you, Lucas. I thought I'd lost you forever." Lucas's eyes softened, filled with regret. "And I hated myself for not getting to you sooner. I wanted to tell you the truth, but seeing you with him, seeing how he had positioned himself as your support, made me hesitate. I didn't want to bring more pain into your life." A breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of music as guests began to trickle out of the hall. The tension of the day still clung to the air, but there was a calmness settling between them, a shared understanding that spoke louder than words. Elena wiped the tears from her cheeks, a mixture of grief and determination in her gaze. It wasn't just pain, Lucas. It was a lie, a life built on deceit. And today, standing in that hall, I realized that I've been living in the shadow of that lie for far too long. Lucas reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't have to live in that shadow anymore. We can build something new, something honest, even if it takes time." Elena nodded, a small smile breaking through the storm in her eyes. The path ahead was unclear, filled with questions and challenges, but was a path they could walk together. And that, she realized, was more than enough. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow across the garden, they stood up. The echoes of the past still whispered around them, but they were no longer held captive by them. They were ready to step forward, into a new beginning defined not by secrets, but by the simple truth of their love and the resilience they had found within themselves. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the hall where the last few guests lingered, their whispers carrying a mix of wonder and hope. Elena glanced at Lucas, a renewed sense of purpose sparking in her heart. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. The garden's serenity wrapped around Elena and Lucas like a soft blanket, but the echoes of the day's confrontation still lingered in the back of their minds. The soft murmurs of guests and the fading strains of music from inside the hall hinted at the end of the gathering, yet neither of them felt quite ready to return to that world. They stood on the edge of something new, with the past still clawing at their heels. Elena took a deep breath, her gaze moving over the ornate stone path, winding through beds of roses and lavender. The scent, once soothing, now felt sharp and heavy, a reminder that change was never without thorns. She glanced at Lucas, who was watching the horizon, eyes distant and filled with the weight of everything he had revealed. "Lucas," she said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. He turned to her, his expression softening as their eyes met. "I know we talked about the past, but I need to understand what this means for us now. Charles won't just disappear quietly. He's built his life on power, and he won't give that up without a fight." Lucas's jaw tightened, and he exhaled slowly. "I know. That's what worries me." He took a step closer, his hand brushing against hers. "Today was just the beginning, Elena. Charles is wounded, and men like him lash out when cornered. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next." Elena nodded, the determination in her eyes reflecting the resolve she felt growing within her. "I won't be caught off guard again. Whatever he throws at us, we'll face it together." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Elena's father, who walked toward them with a measured pace. The weight of the day had added lines to his already weathered face, but there was pride in his eyes. "Elena, Lucas," he began, his voice calm, but carrying the authority of a man who had spent a lifetime leading others. "What happened today was unprecedented, but it was necessary. The truth needed to come out." Elena reached for her father's hand, the touch a silent acknowledgement of his support. "Thank you, Father, for believing in me, even when everything seemed impossible." He smiled, a rare, tender expression. "You're stronger than you know. And as for Charles, he'll find that the power he once wielded has limits. The people who stood by him because of his influence will think twice now. They may not rally to your side immediately, but they won't support him as they once did." Lucas nodded, the edge of tension easing slightly from his shoulders. He'll try to spin today's events in his favor, twist the narrative to paint himself as the victim. Elena's father's expression hardened. "Then we need to be prepared. This isn't just about the truth that came out today. It's about protecting what comes next, your safety, your future. And if necessary, standing up to whatever Charles attempts to reclaim his power." The resolve in his voice sparked a fire in Elena. For too long, she had allowed herself to be swept along by forces beyond her control, but now she knew she had allies, people who would stand by her. She looked at Lucas, and then at her father. "We'll be ready. Whatever comes, we'll face it head on." A rustling behind them drew their attention, and a familiar figure stepped forward. It was Grace, one of Elena's oldest friends, and someone who had known Lucas before his disappearance. Her eyes were wide, with a mix of shock and relief. "Elena," she said, breathless, "I came as soon as I heard. I can't believe everything that happened today. Are you okay? Elena managed a smile, the warmth of Grace's concern wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. I'm better than I've been in a long time, Grace. It's been a day of revelations, but it was necessary. Grace's gaze shifted to Lucas, her eyes filling with emotion as she reached out to touch his arm. Lucas, I never thought I'd see you again. What you did today, it was brave. You've given everyone here something to think about. Lucas's expression softened, and he gave a small nod. It wasn't easy, but the truth had to come out. And now, we need to be ready for whatever comes next. The four of them stood together in the fading light, a united front against the uncertainties that lay ahead. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and orange, as if to signal that the storm had passed, but not without leaving its mark. Inside the hall, the last of the guests began to disperse, their conversations a mix of shock and speculation. Charles's absence hung heavy, a reminder that the day's events were far from over. Rumors would spread, alliances would shift, and the balance of power would teeter as people chose sides. Elena turned to Lucas, her voice soft but steady. No matter what happens, I'm glad you came back. Even if it's complicated, even if it's not what we planned, it feels right. Lucas's eyes met hers, the intensity of his gaze softened by the emotion simmering beneath the surface. I'm here, Elena, and I'm not going anywhere this time. Elena's father stepped back, giving them space, but staying close enough to offer silent support. Grace wiped a tear from her cheek, a small, hopeful smile breaking through. You're not alone in this, Elena. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. The four of them stood there, a small circle of hope against the backdrop of a day that had changed everything. And as the last light of the day faded into twilight, a sense of quiet determination settled over them. The battle was not over, but for the first time, Elena felt that she was ready for whatever the future held. The morning light crept over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow that touched the edges of the town and spilled over into the garden where Elena stood. The events of the previous day were still fresh in her mind, echoing with every heartbeat. She had spent the night in a restless daze, replaying Lucas's return, Charles's fall, and the monumental shift in her own understanding of her life. But now, as the sun rose and painted the sky in hues of gold and soft pink, it felt like the beginning of something new, something unburdened by secrets and shadows. Elena took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs and calming the storm within. The garden around her was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds that heralded the new day. She was no longer the woman who had walked down the aisle the day before, unsure and haunted by unspoken fears. Today, she felt a different kind of strength, one that came from embracing the truth, no matter how painful it had been. The sound of footsteps on the stone path drew her attention. Lucas appeared, his expression softer in the gentle morning light. He had spent the night in a nearby guest house, giving her space to process everything that had happened. But now, as he stood before her, the weight of unspoken words settled between them. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and tender. It carried the weight of everything they'd been through, and the promise of everything yet to come. Elena smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Good morning, Lucas." There was a pause, comfortable yet brimming with the anticipation of what needed to be said. "I thought you might want to talk before the day starts," Lucas continued, his gaze searching hers for any sign of doubt or fear. He found none, only resolve and a newfound peace. Elena nodded, turning to face him fully. "I do. Yesterday was more than I ever could have imagined. And yet, waking up today, I feel different, lighter." Lucas's lips curved into a small smile, one that held the echo of the boy she once knew and the man who had returned. That's because you're finally free of the lies, Elena. The truth, no matter how hard it is to face, is always worth it. She reached out, taking his hand in hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. Thank you for coming back, for fighting to bring the truth to light, even when it would have been easier to stay away. Lucas's eyes softened, and he squeezed her hand. I couldn't have done anything else. You were always worth fighting for. A comfortable silence stretched between them as they took in the new morning. The events of the past day had shifted everything, but they both knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Charles's influence, while weakened, would not simply vanish. He was a man with deep connections and the will to retaliate. They would need to be prepared for the ripples that would follow. As if reading her thoughts, Lucas's expression grew serious. We have to be ready for what comes next, Elena. Charles won't let this go easily. Elena nodded, a hint of steel in her eyes. I know, but we're not alone. My father, Grace, and even some of those who were in the hall yesterday, they'll stand with us. He won't be able to sway everyone the way he once did. Lucas's shoulders relaxed slightly, and the shadow of worry eased from his face. With allies like that, we can face whatever comes. And no matter what happens, I won't let you face it alone. A voice called from behind them, breaking the quiet moment. It was Grace, her face alight with relief and determination. There you are. I've been looking for you too. She joined them in the garden, her eyes flicking between them with a smile. Word is already spreading. Some people are questioning Charles's actions, and others are quietly shifting their support. Elena felt a rush of gratitude. Grace had always been a true friend, and now her loyalty was more important than ever. Thank you, Grace, for everything. Grace waved a dismissive hand, but her eyes shone with emotion. You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad to see the truth finally out in the open. She paused, a more serious look crossing her face. But we need to be careful. Charles isn't the kind of man who accepts defeat easily. Lucas's expression hardened. We're aware. But this time, he won't find us unprepared. A gentle breeze swept through the garden, lifting the petals of the flowers and carrying the scent of fresh blooms. It felt like a sign, a whisper of hope in the wake of a storm. Elena looked at her friends, the people who had stood by her, fought for her, and believed in her. She knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Today marks a new chapter, she said, her voice steady. We rebuild, we stay vigilant, and we move forward with the truth on our side. Lucas stepped closer, his presence a comforting weight at her side. And no matter what, we do it together. The three of them stood there in the morning light, bound not just by the events of the day before, but by the shared resolve to face the future. It wouldn't be easy, and the path ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Elena felt ready. The lies had been exposed, the chains of her past broken, and the dawn of a new day promised hope, strength, and love. And as the sun climbed higher, bathing the world in its warmth, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not as a pawn in someone else's game, but as a woman who had reclaimed her life, free, fearless, and ready to write her own story. Now that you've followed this story full of twists and emotions, we'd love to hear from you. Comment below and share what you thought about the plot and which moment was your favorite or most gripping. Don't forget to leave a like. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. This way, you won't miss any new stories we share. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next story.